Hello everybody, welcome to today's video. My name is David Higgins, and today I will be further discussing the idea of evolution. Before we get started, I just want to warn you that this topic requires us to put our thinking caps on. It was a challenging essay to read by Howison, and it's a challenging essay to summarize for a video. I'm going to do my best, but you need to be prepared to be patient and spend a little time thinking hard to see if it makes sense. Of course, I recommend getting the essay yourself. Okay, I guess I should say one more thing as to, why is it even useful to worry about the idea of evolution at all? I mean, what difference does it make in our practical life? And the difference I believe it makes to, analyze our intellectual content, even if it's content that's not necessarily in the forefront of our daily lives, is because, if we are able to find answers for, the big questions in life, satisfying answers, and we can be sure that, we have at least a relatively good grasp on the rules that we're, facing as we're making choices in our lives. Not only will we have a increased level of peace of mind that just is there in the background of our daily struggle, but, we'll have a clearer mind in order to make practical decisions from. So a mind that's clouded by uncertainty and anxiety doesn't work as efficiently as a clear mind that has a firm foundation. So it is practical to think about philosophical things, because the philosophical things are basically the foundation for the lower level of thinking that we use when we deal with our bank account or our neighbors. The reason that we need to determine whether or not evolution as an idea has cosmic reach is because we need to determine whether our personal consciousness is dependent on nature or not, whether nature existed prior to our individual consciousness, and therefore our individual consciousness is a product of time and space and therefore is not eternal. And if we can figure out whether or not our consciousness is not dependent on nature, therefore not dependent on time, therefore exists outside of time, we can find assurance that our individual consciousness will not perish when this particular cycle of time reaches its culmination. Okay, so that's the reason why we should carefully analyze the idea of evolution, because there are certain schools of thought that would have us believe that our consciousness arose through an evolutionary process, whereas Howison, with his metaphysical system called personal idealism, argues that nature is actually the product of our consciousness. I will be discussing the second half of the essay titled "The Limit of Evolution" by George Holmes Howison. This is the book where the essay can be found. The book can be found on Google Play and on used book websites. The philosopher George Howison has a unique approach. He has a very strong dependence on abstract logic, and he combines different categories of philosophy, including analysis of the phenomenal experience, the fundamentals of social ethics and moral roots. He's definitely metaphysically focused, and there's a strong teleological and theological element. Okay, so generally philosophy is the endeavor to understand fundamental truths about the world that we find ourselves in and our relationship to it and our relationship to others. And philosophers hope to find a unified, systematic understanding of reality in all its forms, including the level of abstract thought. Okay, so metaphysics usually focuses on first principles and concentrates on, the level of our experienced reality that is sort of above purely phenomenal or external reality. Okay, and addresses, cause and source very specifically. Teleology is sort of a specific department of that where it's understood that the things that we perceive can find a rational basis if we focus on the purpose of the phenomena or its use. Okay, so Howison's main goal is to justify rationally his personal idealism. Okay, so that's the name of the metaphysical system that he sort of put in place uniquely. Idealism, is the notion that reality is all based in consciousness, and that the external reality is actually an outbirth of consciousness. And what personal idealism expresses is that subjective reality is the external realization of the eternal individual free consciousness. Okay, and the overall objective reality is the harmonized unity of all individual consciousnesses and their harmony with the universal ideal consciousness, which is God. Okay, so according to Howison, his definition is that a conscious center is a fully integrated, unique personality and is functioning within the universal social context. Okay, so his approach is strongly teleological, meaning that it's focused on use and purpose, because his system is focused or is an outbirth of the concept of a personal divine conscious center. Okay, so reality is not just a sort of transcendent, formless sea of consciousness, but it's an actual individualized, infinitely individualized, personal conscious center, okay, which is the divine. So if you're the typical understanding of a person includes the reality of personal intention. So it's an essential part of having characters, having intentions towards what is outside of itself. Okay, so that is, essentially teleological, meaning it's focused on use. Okay, so Howison is really metaphilosophical because he really stresses the primacy of rational, moral, and ethical principles in the overall human universe as distinct essential realities. Okay, so philosophical thought can often, sort of minimize the impact of ethics and morals, but when Howison is talking about a personal universe, both on the macro and micro level, obviously the ethical and moral content of that is the glue that holds it all together. So he's he's a unique individual because he really does stress ethics and morals as a main element in the overall reality. It's not just a byproduct or an add-on. Self-definition through acknowledgement of other conscious centers and the divine is the avenue in which we establish our presence in reality. And that individuality established through relative self-definition is a sacred notion in his system. And ideas like evolution are secondary. So the essay here about the limit of evolution is really addressing how evolution impacts personal idealism and explores whether or not personal idealism can stand up and sort of handle the idea of evolution, because the big question is whether consciousness has its source in evolution, which would make it dependent upon external reality. And so that would make the soul dependent, it would make the individual consciousness dependent, and therefore not free. Okay, so he's exploring whether or not evolution is compatible with the notion of individual freedom. Okay, so in part one, we saw how Howison points out there are 4 issues that basically form gaps in the application of evolution to the overall reality that we experience. Okay, and the first gap that he pointed out was the fact that there's a inability for evolution to account for purely rational realities. Okay, so the ideas of time and space are present in consciousness prior to the advent of any personal experiences, and so it can be said to be a priori equipment of the individual consciousness. So consciousness does not have its source in evolution, quite simply, right there. And I suppose we could just kind of walk away and dismiss evolution at this point, but he's obviously willing to be much more thorough than that. Okay, so the next gap that he pointed out was the gap between the organic and the inorganic. Evolution's accounting for the upward ascent of phenomenal reality through various manifestations, and inorganic matter is more simple, therefore it is placed on a lower order of reality than organic matter. Okay, so there's a gap if you're saying, well, the lower level precludes the next level in ascent. So organic matter comes from inorganic matter, but evolution really has no way to account for that. Okay, then there's the gap between that sort of phenomenal reality that has a mind and that phenomenal reality which does not have a mind. So the fourth limit that Howison pointed out in the first half of the essay was that there's an inexplicability at the heart, or the starting point, of the idea of evolution. Okay, so basically we're faced with the fact that reality does not evolve continuously, but jumps from stage to stage. The mind observes the discrete transitional increments that are taking place there. The evolution dynamic observed in biologically genetic reproductive behaviors does not cover the level jumps in the range of phenomena. The question remains, is it possible that the evolution idea can somehow span those gaps? Is it to be validated as an idea that has transcendent application? What is the thing that creates our noticing of the limits? Okay, so it's obviously the mind that is noticing the limits. Okay, the mind defines whether or not evolution is judged valid or even invalid. So we can see that the limits of evolution are determined by the mind. The gaps are noticed by the mind, and so it is the prerogative of the mind to accept the idea of evolution, level-to-level evolution, as valid or invalid. Okay, and Howison wants to take a closer look at the idea of evolution to determine its real significance in the mind, so that we can truly understand whether or not it applies gracefully. These are the basic elements of the idea of evolution. Okay, it partakes of time and space because it involves series and proximity. So there's one object related to another in time and space, and there's a transition from lower to higher. The second part of evolution is in its acknowledgement of change and progression, meaning it is a dynamic idea. Okay, it's about ascent. So the idea of evolution is contained by time and space. In order for evolution to apply as a universal metaphysical philosophy, it has to work in three additional areas, and it might seem at a glance as if it does, but we need to be careful to see if it actually does. Okay, so for it to be valid across the whole range of our phenomenal experience, it has to have a serial connection. So each phenomenal development has to be framed in a series that is inevitable and is consistent enough that we can generalize from it. Okay, so we know certainly that evolution applies to biological reality, and you can see it consistently enough to be able to generalize from one species to the next. But we need to be able to see that the evolution idea is part of an unbroken series across all phenomena, okay, in order for it to be considered a metaphysically valid idea. Okay. So we would need to be able to see that the mineral kingdom led in series naturally and consistently to the plant kingdom, which naturally and consistently leads to the animal kingdom, which naturally and consistently leads to humanity, and in particular human consciousness, which is the distinguishing element that sets humanity apart from the animal kingdom. The second element that evolution has to incorporate is logical unity. Does it make sense? Okay. Logic is basically the spontaneous connection within the mind of similarities into a harmonious pattern. Okay, and when it's viewed from above, a string of logic will appear as a unity. We have to maintain the perspective that the natural objects that we observe are actually ideas. Okay, so this is, at the heart of the philosophy of idealism. Essentially like a rock is an idea, a plant is an idea, a human being is an idea. And those ideas can, in fact, be strung together in a logical series as an evolutionary series, if we're cognizant of the way in which we do it. Okay, the final element that's required is obviously that it needs to show reality's connection to a source. It has to provide ultimate causation. Howison says that evolution can only unite all of the phenomenal elements in our experience, if they're understood to be a part of a single intelligible plan. He calls this cosmic genesis, the genesis of one conception or one idea from another conception by virtue of its membership in a system of conceptions that are organized by an all-embracing idea. Okay, so the other phrase that he often uses relative to this idea is final cause or ideal cause, and he really goes thoroughly into that in the subsequent essay in the book titled The Harmony of Determinism and Freedom. But in short, final cause is cause driven by the existence of a universal ideal. Okay, so all of reality is inspired by a universal ideal reality. Okay, and that ideal reality can be seen as an all-embracing idea or an intelligible single plan. So this primal cause, Howison presents a pretty convincing argument that it is the only true cause, and he proceeds to analyze the connection between serial phenomenal events, meaning events that occur in sequence. It appears as if one event, because it precedes the other in sequence, causes the next, but the true nature of the nexus, the connection point between the prior event and the subsequent event, what actually inspires the next step in the sequence, is often just called a certain energetic impulse by sort of less vague philosophers. But Howison says that that's like just an inaccurate abstraction that's not accurate enough to be acceptable. So he basically dismisses that nexus point as being understood as containing a causative energy, but it's merely a transmissive energy, and that all apparently natural causes are merely the result of transmissive reality between events in our perception. So when Howison declares somewhat dogmatically that the mind produces nature, unfortunately he doesn't really provide a direct, deliberate description of, say, how any particular natural object comes into our awareness. Like, well, here's a coffee cup. How did my mind produce that? And because he really concentrates on the abstract sort of rational pathway to just indicate that this is an outbirth of the consciousness, without giving much by way of a technical description of the actual manifestation process. There's much more light on that subject available in the writing of Emanuel Swedenborg, and I definitely have the ambition to address that issue in a future video. So he basically, okay, so Howison will just say that the connection between the mind and nature is ideally genetic, not in terms of genes or reproductive, but in terms of genesis. And he kind of just leaves it right there. Through our mental activity of giving objects context and rational form, the phenomenon we encounter, we create nature with our mind on an essential level. So he's not really talking about physical, manifestational processes, but rather the giving of reality in the sense of the spiritual essential reality, not the physical reality. So around page 44 or 45, Howison begins to address transcendental idealism, okay, which is idealism that's based on the notion of a overall sea of consciousness that is the basis for reality, in juxtaposition to agnostic physicalist evolutionism. But neither one of those ideas views human consciousness as having an existence prior to phenomenal reality. Okay, so the human mind, as it is understood to be specifically human with personality and freedom, isn't really an idea that is present in either one of those philosophical approaches. Okay, so transcendental idealism does go a little bit further than agnostic physical evolutionism, and it does recognize the existence of a self-conscious nature at the heart of reality, but it doesn't include individual consciousness. And with personal idealism, the overarching goal is always to justify rationally the individual consciousness in a state of freedom. So it is always Howison's ambition to prove the immortality of the individual consciousness. The question is the mind a phenomenon that is in time and space and of time and space, or is it transcendent? If it is transcendent, that is to say, it is not a product of evolution. We have determined that time, space, causation, logical unity, and the ideal all exist in human consciousness prior to experience. Agnostic evolutionary physicalists posit that these concepts are present in the individual mind through their establishment over generations. Addressing the existence of the ideas of time and space, causation, logical unity, and the ideal within the mind, agnostics point to the notion that these concepts have established themselves in the mind through a buildup that is explicable by evolution. Pantheistic evolutionary idealists believe the origin of these fundamental mental concepts is the mind of God, and these things are established in the individual consciousness gradually through evolution, psychic evolution. Howison instead argues that these things are part of the interior level of the individual mind. The next item that Howison discusses is the ideal nature of time. For subjective reality to exist, in order for it to be even conceived of, time is a foundational necessity, because without it there's no context for any experience whatsoever. The same logic applies to space, causation, logical unity, and ideality, because without these five foundational concepts we can actually form no associative thoughts. The essential characteristic nature of the individual man originates when the I is conceived within this fivefold foundational set of ideas. This is the beginning of the individual intelligence becoming a reality. So with that, we've reached proof that what is distinctly meant by man as an individual intelligent center is not the result of evolution. Man, which is to say the spirit within the man, is his real mind, and it is not the offspring of nature, but it can be seen that nature is the offspring of the spiritual or rational level of the man. So here's a quote from page 47. To creatively think and to be a world is what it means to be a man. To think and enact such a world merely in the unit framed for it by natural causation is what it means to be a natural man. To think and enact it in its higher unity, the unity framed by supernatural causation of pure ideals, and supremely the moral ideal, is what it means to be a spiritual man, a moral or religious man, or in the philosophical and true sense of the words, a supernatural being, a being transcendent and yet including nature, not excluding or annulling it. Evolution itself, then, not just evolutionary philosophy, finds in the rational nature of man its source and its footing and the final limit of its application. Essential human nature is progressively rational, and it is trending towards the ideal because it is born of the ideal. The next question that Howison tackles is evolution consistent with the Christian religion? The scientific method employs a limited version of evolution. Within that version, its application is perfectly legitimate. The limits of evolution have been demonstrated in this essay, so it shows that evolution as a philosophy does not have cosmic reach. Christian philosophy includes the concept of divine personality and human freedom. Evolution does not negate either one of those concepts. The philosophy of evolution is in agreement with Christian philosophy as long as it recognizes divine personality and human freedom. And it recognizes that evolution does not produce consciousness, but it is just the driving force of the ascent of rationality. Evolution as a doctrine of natural science does not have cosmic reach and does not, therefore, impact true rational religion, which sheds light on the soul. Evolution is natural and reality is spiritual. Okay, well, we've reached the limit of this essay and the limit of this video about this essay. It was quite a bit to chew on, and I can't stress enough that if you really want to get a handle on Howison's philosophy, the book is indispensable. This video is, really not enough to get a real grip on the ideas. So I really recommend it, and I'm not sure if I'm done with this book or not. Okay, so there's two other essays in this book that I have not read. One is titled The Art Principle as Represented in Poetry. The other one is Later German Philosophy. For now, this will do it, and I hope that you found something worthwhile in today's video, and I hope that you will like and subscribe and tune in for future episodes. Have a great day.